Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today. We're discussing reconciliation and the treaty relationship. And so today we have a special guest with us, Treaty Commissioner Loretta Ross, and we're going to be hearing from her in just a bit. And so just to get our event started in a good way, I am going to ask Grace if she would be willing to open up in prayer and also do a land acknowledgement.
So we are presently standing on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, and we acknowledge the harms that were done and still being done to the First Peoples. Jansik Pias Nina. In spirit of reconciliation, Creator, we ask you to guide us and keep us in good frame and mind as well as our help as we begin the meeting of the 94 Calls to Action. Opamachi huo kabe pagusen mitin taganuenimia. The Menoya, which hina na sumagape the Hamigisia. Exani Kakinawakumami.
Miigwech, Grace. Tansa, my name is Susan Bowen. I am Swampy Cree from Treaty 5 territory. Currently, I'm residing in Ontario. And yeah, so I am the Indigenous community recruiter for Circles for Reconciliation here in Ontario. I've been with Circles since 2018. And yeah, so what we do, so those who are not too familiar with what we do. So what we do is we provide opportunity for 5 Indigenous and 5 non-Indigenous participants to sit together for 10 weeks and sit and discuss various issues that are outlined in the TRC. And so it's done in a circle setting, and our guidelines follow the 7 sacred teachings of the Anishinaabe. And in the time that I've been with Circles, I have seen a lot of relationships be created between our Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants. Many of our participants go on to become facilitators for the circles as well. So a lot of education does take place and a lot of learning takes place, and that's vital to learning more about reconciliation. How do you move forward with reconciliation? So today's theme or today's topic, treaties and relationships and how vital they are, and recognizing that it takes many of us to this new part of our journey that we're in as a society in Canada. What do we need to do? So having that communication going, and what can we do to make things better for our young ones coming in the future? I'm a mother of 5 and a grandmother of 1, and even today I still see the impacts of residential school and what many of our children still have to overcome, and then building those healthy communities. So the circles themselves have shown a lot of many of our Canadian participants that there is work to do, and as much as they have to become, the key question is, how do I become an ally? How do I build that relationship? So best by education, taking the time to learn, as if you would go to university and get an education and a degree. It's the same way that you want to educate yourself to improve the future of your own family as well in this time that we're in. So yeah, it's a very rewarding opportunity to be part of these circles, and we do find that since May this year, when the discoveries started taking place, our registrations have actually skyrocketed amongst our non-Indigenous participants. So we've been putting our calls out for Indigenous participants to come learn more about us and have your voice, and taking that time to learn, not so much learn, but take part in this journey that many of us are on. And yeah, so that's what kind of a summarize of who we are, what we do, and there's so much more involved to it. And yeah, so I'll say miigwech, Commissioner, for today, and miigwech, Jimmy, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion today and everything, all wise words. Miigwech.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. You heard a little bit about Susan and Circles for Reconciliation. So Reconciliation is a nonprofit organization. Our purpose is to teach as many people as possible about the basics of reconciliation and how to combat racism We're an organization that wants to empower leaders, to find and seek to empower leaders who want to be change agents in their communities and in their organizations. And we do this through online media by providing videos and teaching resources to those who are both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples that really want to start to create some action about in regards to reconciliation. And so we recently finished our 94-94 campaign. A lot of people are here and you're joining us because of this 94-94 campaign. And so we just want to do a quick recap of that. So the 94-94 campaign started in response to the initial discoveries of the 215 children in Kamloops, BC. So as an organization, Circles for Reconciliation and Reconciliation Thunder, we got together and we said, how do we use this moment and this opportunity to really educate Canadians? Because people have been asking, what can we do and how can we respond? And one of the key things is to get as many people as possible to start their learning journey about learning about reconciliation and learning about the treaties. So what we did is we shared one call to action every day for all the 94 days leading up to Orange Shirt Day, which also became the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So our campaign was very successful. We had, just on Facebook alone, we had 300 people sharing every single day. So if you multiply that times 94 days, it's about 30,000 shares and a reach of 1.3 million. And so that's just on Facebook. We also shared on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And so we're looking at doing this again. We're going to be talking about that later on in the session. We're going to be doing 94-94 in 2022. And we're going to be sending out a survey for people who want to give us more feedback in terms of what we can do differently and how to improve. Originally, what we were going to do in this session was we were going to review all the different videos that were responses to the 94-94 challenge. But we thought that due to the limited amount that we had coming in, we thought that it's best to spend more time focusing on this treaty relationship and how we can move forward together. We want to thank everybody who made a donation to the 94-94 campaign. As you can see here, this is the budget that we shared at the very end of our campaign. And we had a significant amount of donations since then. I think within the first 3 days, we had 25% of the amount recovered in donations. We want to thank Steve Andrews for donating his time completely for the web design for the project. So the total campaign costs were $6,359. To date, we've received $5,553, which means we only have 803 left. And so from this point forward, all donations that come into Reconciliation Thunder will be used to cover the cost of this campaign first. If anyone is here who wants to support recovering the cost of the 94-94 campaign, you can go to reconciliationthunder.org. You can send an e-transfer to finance@reconciliationthunder.org. And yep, all those donations will be helpful. If we have anything in addition to the 803, we're going to start using that for preparing for next year, the 94-94 for 2022. So today we have Commissioner Ross joining us. She's the Commissioner of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. So Loreta Ross, she is a member of Hollowater First Nation in Manitoba. She obtained her law degree from Queen's University and has been a practicing lawyer for over 20 years. She has been providing legal advice to different First Nations organizations, including the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the Assembly of First Nations. She has served as counsel for First Nations on child and family matters, residential school claims, and land issues, including specific claims, treaty land entitlement, and trusts. Loreta's grandfather, George Barker, served for 44 years as chief of Hollowater, and he taught her from an early age that as a First Nations person, she would always carry the responsibility of educating people on behalf of First Nations people. Loreta is also a big believer in family and community and strives to find balance between work and family. Loreta loves to curl, golf, and watch her children participate in their extracurricular activities and in their spare time. And so with that, we want to welcome Commissioner Ross. And And yeah, so Commissioner Ross, welcome here. If you want to share a little bit more about yourself and about the work of the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, yeah, feel free to take a moment to do that.
Okay, well, thanks, Jimmy, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to come and spend some time with you this evening to address some of the calls to action, 94 calls to action, specifically as they relate to treaties. As Jimmy said, I'm a member of the Hollow Water First Nation, Treaty 5, yay. Susan, yay, Treaty 5. And I've been, as you said, a practicing lawyer for a number of years. And obviously I don't practice law in my role as the treaty commissioner, and have been in this role since 2017. I've always, I guess in the work that I've done, worked to build and educate relations between First Nations and non-First Nations people, and try to look at the system that we find ourselves in, whether it's the education, political, legal, and see how we can make changes. I've always grown up and through my grandfather and my grandmother and my parents understood that as First Nations people, never surrendered our way of life, never surrendered the land. And, you know, in this day and age, and in looking at the history of the relations between First Nations and non-First Nations people, we see that that has been challenged through legislation, policy, and forced means. And we have to get back and take a look at that and understand, you know, why that happened. Some of our elders always say, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've been. And that means taking a hard look at our history and where that history came together, and what went wrong, and how we now are left with the challenge of rectifying that and addressing that, and making sure, one, that it doesn't happen again, but two, how we can heal and make amends and move forward in a good way. So that, you know, the work that I'm doing now, it seems it's been a natural progression to the work that I've always done. So this role fits nicely with me, and it fits nicely, I think, with my personality as well, and my training, both in Western education training, but also in the education by my elders and family members. So that's it in a snapshot. Jimmy.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much, Commissioner. And yeah, we're super excited to have you here. Thanks so much for being here. And I think that what we should do, just to start everyone off, is just for those who are brand new to the concept of the treaty relationship, can you explain to us what is a treaty, and what's meant by the phrase "we are all treaty people"?
Well, a treaty in the context of First Nations people and non-First Nations people is an agreement to come to learn how to live and share these lands. And from a First Nation perspective, treaty making was a part of First Nation way of life. They've shared these lands with other First Nations people, as between the Anishinaabe and the Inuit. I'm trying to think, Inuit. And you know, so the treaty was a natural way of relating. And so it wasn't anything new by the time that Europeans came and the British came and entered into treaties with the first peoples. And of course, the British also had treaty making processes, how to deal with issues. Usually it was through after war had begun and that type of thing. So treaties were used by both parties and in different ways in terms of establishing relations. First Nations and the Crown in Canada have had different treaties, and they're called different things across the country. In Manitoba, where we find ourselves, they are referred to as the Numbered Treaties, in which case there was 11 of them that were entered into, and 7 of them are found within the boundaries of Manitoba. They extend beyond the boundaries of Manitoba, but if you look at Manitoba itself, there are 7 of them with communities in Manitoba. Treaty 9 is also in Manitoba, but no communities of Treaty 9 are located within the province. So really it was a way to share the land. They're not land surrender agreements as we've been taught. Certainly not from a First Nation perspective. And I think that's clearly an area that requires reconciliation, as we move forward, is to have that conversation as well.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. So I think that at this point, what we're going to do is, so we just finished going through our 94 in 94. So where we shared each of the 94 calls to action over 94 days, and we created these graphics. And so there's a couple of them that I'd like to highlight, and specifically because of the intersection with the treaty relationship. So call to action number 63, the summary is that we call upon the Council of Ministers of Education in Canada to maintain an annual commitment to Aboriginal education issues. And a subsection of this call to action calls for education for kindergarten to grade 12 education. And so can you tell us a little bit about what resources that the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba has available for kindergarten to grade 12 teachers and students?
Sure. We have an education, what we call an education kit, and it's really treaty education resources to assist teachers to introduce and implement treaty education across the province. So it's meant for all teachers, all schools, regardless of where, whether you're a provincial school or whether you're a First Nation school, an independent school. It's meant for all teachers, and it's broken down by grade. So you could teach different concepts, for example, from kindergarten to grade 6, from grade 7 to grade 12. And so there are teacher guides, there's a treaty vocabulary, there's maps, DVDs, we use puppets. We have a film in there that's available to help, especially the younger students, understand what treaty making is, books, and then there's other resources. And we also offer training for this. We don't give these kits just to anybody that asks, because there's a whole contextual piece that needs to go along with these, which includes First Nation elders talking about that perspective of First Nations to treaty making. And so it provides a more holistic and fulsome preparation, I guess, for teachers in order for them to be able to properly deliver treaty education in the classroom. So our kit is designed to teach teachers how to teach treaty in the classroom. Now say that 3 times. And so we offer a portal on our website for teachers to access. There's PowerPoints that they can use. There's presenters that can come out and speak to their classrooms. There's what we call in-school support. So we have resource people that are available to go out and assist teachers. There's lesson plans, there's Black Line Masters, right? That's teacher talk. And, as much as possible to make it easier for teachers to teach treaties in the classroom. Yeah,
so if there's any teachers on the call here, there's going to be a chance afterwards for communication, so and questions. So if you have any questions about any of these resources, now is the time to ask. And so, yeah, so education is so incredibly important in terms of moving reconciliation forward, and it's mentioned quite a bit. One of the key pieces that's important for people to know about is the Royal Proclamation. And so Call to Action 45 talks about the Royal Proclamation and the Covenant of Reconciliation. And so the summary of this call is, we call upon the Government of Canada to develop a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. And so the more detailed version of the text talks about how this new proclamation would be based off of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and informed and built upon the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. So, Commissioner, can you tell us a little bit about what those two are? What was the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and what was the Treaty of Niagara?
The Royal Proclamation, and there's a lot of events that surround the why the Royal Proclamation was brought into being, and obviously we don't have the time to talk about that, but there's a significant impact by First Nations as well as to why that occurred. In any event, King George III was the one who brought that into play. And it really was a way for the Crown to deal with the First Peoples of these lands. And it set out guidelines for how the Crown would deal with First Nations people. It recognized, and this is important for First Nations people, it recognized that First Nations were nations. And so you've probably heard that, and they've carried that on from that point and forward. And so that recognized, as I said, First Nations as nations to be dealt with when occupying these lands, or as the Crown would view it, as taking up these lands. And really it set out the treaty making process that was to occur, that lands, First Nation lands, had to be acquired through treaty in order for them to be valid, and that was to be done through the Crown. So it really set that process and placed the Crown as the entity that would deal with First Nations people. So, you know, it set out the things that had to be consent, it had to be in a public place. So, you know, the treaty making process from the Crown's perspective, at least, was set out in the Royal Proclamation. And that, as you said, was in 1763. The Treaty of Niagara and the Royal Proclamation, by the way, is within the Canadian Constitution. It was, and it still is, a part of the Canadian Constitution. So it's important and certainly relevant in the relations between First Nations and Government of Canada. The Treaty of Niagara is a document that was, not a document, it was a treaty that was entered into a year later in 1764, again around the Niagara area, where the representative of the Crown brought the essence of the Royal Proclamation to First Nation leadership. And calls were sent out. I guess our equivalent of emails were sent to various leaders, including leaders from as far west as here in Manitoba and northern Manitoba. And they traveled to Niagara to hear what the Crown and the British Crown was proposing in terms of how they would relate to each other. And you know, there's different accounts that the Royal Proclamation itself was translated into the languages of the First People, so they understood the intention of the British Crown in this relationship. And it talked about this act or the way of creating would be through treaties, that it would be a respect of First Nations as nations, that they would share the land, that they would continue to respect and recognize and acknowledge First Nations as nations, and they would work out how they would be together, that they would do this in partnership. And if you see the treaty through a wampum belt, it's they're holding hands essentially side by side, entering into this relationship. It wasn't one of conquering, it wasn't one of you know, land surrender. It was, each was to maintain who they were as nations as they entered into this relationship. The Treaty of Niagara you don't find in the Canadian Constitution, and so it falls essentially by the wayside in the way that the Canadian or Canada as a country has developed. But still, there are things from the Royal Proclamation, I think, that benefit the positive relations between First Nations and the Crown. But the Treaty of Niagara is an essential part of understanding that history as well.
So then the Royal Proclamation, it set out all the standards for treaty making and identified and recognized Indigenous nations as nations. And it's a framework that Canada has used to make treaties. And so it's interesting that, I mean, as I understand, the original idea behind the Treaty of Niagara was to recognize that it's a one-sided document, and in order for it to be relevant for Indigenous nations is to create it into a treaty. So so that's kind of interesting that you know, they went through that process, and yet here we are years later where that fell by the wayside. It's not part of the Canadian Constitution. That's yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, well, theoretically, right, the Canadian Constitution is also a unilateral document, a Canadian document, and you have the treaties, the numbered treaties, which is that joint process, just like the Treaty of Niagara represents the joint process. And you have these legal documents, the Royal Proclamation, the Canadian Constitution, which governs Canada.
Wow, that's very interesting. former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Murray Sinclair, he said that he had a love-hate relationship with the Royal Proclamation. Do you remember, can you elaborate on that love-hate relationship and what does he love about it and hate?
Well, I don't want to put words certainly in his mouth, but my take on that, and I believe I remember what he said was, you know, the love is that it did recognize First Peoples as nations that had to be dealt with in this process, or the way that Britain was coming on these lands and wanting to settle on these lands. So it recognized First Nations as nations, but it also forced First Nations, or that the entity that they had to deal with was the British Crown. And so it you know, kind of took away a choice by First Nations as to who they wanted to deal with, and kind of forced a certain process on it that was not one that First Nations necessarily chose to deal with. So, you know, and it continues to be that way, right? That Canada dictates how it wants to deal, and kind of imposes and forces those processes on that relationship.
So moving a little bit further into Call to Action 45, there's one phrase that I think would be good for us to unpack a little bit. So Call to Action 45 in subsection 4, the phrase reads like this, that we're to reconcile Aboriginal and Crown constitutional and legal orders to ensure that Aboriginal peoples are full partners in Confederation. So what does this phrase mean? How can we reconcile Aboriginal and Crown constitutional and legal orders to ensure that Aboriginal peoples are full partners in Confederation?
Well, I think there's a lot to this statement, but you know, you have to recognize that First Nations people are more than Indian bands that are recognized right now in the constitutional legal order, right? I mean, First Nations people had their own governance systems and were nations. So how do you reconcile that? You have to have those conversations, and those are tough conversations, and those you know, we tried that, or it was tried back when you know, Canada was repatriating its constitution, and we had the constitutional talks specifically on Aboriginal people, and they failed, and we've been trying to have those talks to date. And so those are difficult to have, but you know, it's essentially dealing with how do you have lands where you have two different legal orders, two different systems. The Canadian legal order is you have your federal government, you have the provincial government, and then you have, you know, the municipal and other governments within that. And then you have the First Nation governance systems. And the way that the First Nation governance systems have traditionally been is not recognized in the Canadian constitutional legal system. And you have to reconcile that. You have to have that conversation in order to move forward, right? And if that's what Confederation means, is bringing the people together, you have to respect that. And so go back to what those original relations were. If we talk about that they were recognized as nations, what does that mean today? What does that mean? And do changes have to occur within the Canadian Constitution to recognize that, but also maybe to relate to the First Nation governments, right? So it's not an easy question to answer by any means. It's not an easy question to unpack, but you do have to have that conversation, and you have to be open to that. And if you think of First Nations people, you know, they've only been recognized as Indian bands, and that's happened for, you know, for the majority of the relationship between First Nations and government. And so moving away from that practically and legally, and you know, is going to be a challenge, despite the fact that there are First Nation governance systems are still in place today. right? So balancing even those governance systems with the Indian band concept under the Indian Act is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, I think that there are people that are even today that are surprised to hear that Aboriginal peoples or Indigenous peoples were not partners in Confederation. You know, I think people when whether they're entering into Canada or whether they're born here, you know, just to look back and to think, well, who were partners at Confederation? And originally you had a collection of colonies that came together, and they decided on their constitution, and they decided how they would balance powers. And then now you switch over to First Nations that are actual nations, and they didn't sit at the same table, and they didn't go through the same processes, and they didn't have the same original input into the Constitution. And so I think we need to start there and make sure that every Canadian knows that that's our history. And so to get there, and then to realize that, yeah, you're right. Like, we have to figure out, so how do you reconcile those, and how do you reconcile our constitutions? And just like you said, in 1982, that was when Indigenous people from all across Canada were recognizing that if Canada is repatriating its constitution, we want to make sure that our treaty rights are recognized in this constitution. And they did a lot of work to make sure that it's there in Section 35. And so, but even then, like you said, the constitutional conferences that were supposed to take place, we started to develop a framework of reconciling these two, and they failed. And I think a lot of Canadians don't know that. They don't know that that we tried, and that there's a lot of work to do. So yeah, so there's definitely is a lot of work. And so I think this call to action is a good way for us to start educating Canadians so that they know more about their constitution and their history.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the next call that we're chatting about here is number 46. And so this one, the summary is, we call upon the parties to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement to develop and sign a covenant of reconciliation. And so this is to the parties of the residential school agreement initially, but the call to action further explains that other parties can sign on to this covenant of reconciliation as well. So the question here is, the covenant of reconciliation calls for the renewal or establishment of treaty relationships. So what does this mean, and why is it important?
Well, the treaty relationships was the foundation of Canada and moving forward. I mean, without First Nations and those treaties, there would be no Canada. And you know, but I think the spirit and intent of those relationships has been forgotten about, minimized, discarded. You know, any one of those things that hasn't formed the basis of the relationship moving forward. And so, you know, the renewal of it is say, hey, go back to what the original intent of these agreements were, these understandings, these relationships, and move forward in that way. But that requires that you do the work, right? That you do take the time to sit and meet with your treaty partner as First Nations people and get that understanding, get that basic understanding. Because if you don't have that basic understanding, and everything else, in my opinion, is meaningless if you don't have the essence of and the understanding of what that relationship is. And you know, there are parts of this country, BC, for example, that don't have treaties. So you would, you know, could create new relationships, if that's what that's referring to, establishment of treaty relationships. How are you going to work together? You still have to figure out a way how you're going to do that. Whether you have historical treaties or whether you're moving forward, you still have to have those treaties and those principles set out. And you know, it guides us then how we're going to relate to each other, how we're going to treat each other. If we decide to have this coexistence and side by side, well, how you deal with your laws on one side and how it's going to impact your treaty partner is a consideration that you have to have. And so you have to have good relations, good treaty relations with each other, because you're going to impact each other, you know, in some way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of Canadians don't realize that, yeah, there are unceded areas, you know, there are areas where there aren't treaties. And so So yeah, I think that's important to recognize as well too.
Just a point of clarification there in terms of the words unceded areas. It depends on how you're using that word. Despite the fact that if you look at the written texts of the numbered treaties and you see that clause that says these lands are hereby, the Indians hereby cede, surrender, and yield up lands and give a description of that, that's in the written text of the treaty. But if you look at the First Nation perspective, there's no such concept of ceding of lands. So even if you're in treaties 1 to 11 and that comes up, First Nations people will say that's not our understanding. Again, it's a sharing of the land, and sharing of the land is considerably different than surrendering the land and ceding the land to somebody else. And First Nation worldview doesn't allow for that. It's not a concept that's held by First Nations people. So, you know, the words that we use have considerable impact in those relationships as well. And it's the sharing of the land is not intended the way of land surrenders, for example, right? So just a point of clarification, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point of clarification. So unceded doesn't necessarily imply there's no treaty there. You know, it's those are different concepts.
Yeah, and you know, some people say them to distinguish between what, you know, the numbered treaties number 1 to 11 are often referred to as land surrender treaties, which they're not, which they weren't intended to be. So sometimes when people say the unceded territory, it's to either compare it to the numbered treaties or just to make the statement, regardless of where we are, the lands were, in the opinion of First Nations, unceded. Right. So there's a couple of ways that can be interpreted and understood. And so as long as you're aware of that, I think it brings clarification to the conversation.
That's a really good point of clarification, because even what we're seeing now is that when people are doing land acknowledgements, there are people that are modifying words and changing words. And I think every single word of a land acknowledgement is important, because we saw recently on the East Coast, there was some change in wording that actually takes away the significance and purpose of the land acknowledgement. And so this speaks as well to the importance of having the right words for the land acknowledgement as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So the next call to action that we're going to be looking at is actually a whole bunch. So here we have call to action number 24 in relations to health, call to action number 93 in relation to newcomers, 92 in relation to business, 28 in relation to justice, 57 in related to professional development and training in public service, and call to action 86 in relation to media and reconciliation. And so this is an example of the importance of education on the treaties. And so these 6 are, what these all have in common is that they are all talking about the importance of providing training for people in these different sectors of society. So whether it's managers providing education for their staff, whether it's people in journalist schools, whether it's people practicing law in law schools, and so on in health. It's talking about educating the next generation in these different sectors on the importance of our history. And in each and every one of these cases, that education system mentions as a subsection our treaty relationship. And so the question here is, and this is our final question before we break into group discussion, is why should healthcare professionals, law students, public servants, journalists, managers, church leaders, and newcomers to Canada learn about treaties, and how would life be different if they did?
Well, you know, going back to a point that I made earlier, the treaties really were about how we were to relate to each other. And treaty for First Nations people means, you know, to be who they are. And so you are who you are in the healthcare system, in the legal system, in whatever you do. The treaty filters through it. Every day is living treaty, right? Being who you are as a First Nation person and a non-First Nation person, because you're living treaty, you're enjoying who you are for the most part. I mean, there's always, you know, issues along the way, and that's why you have amendments to legislation and remedies to different recourses. But for the most part, Canada has built itself so that people can be free and can be who they are, and that's what the treaty process is all about. So regardless of what field of work you are in, it's that relationship, right? And being who you are, and making society good for everyone. So it applies everywhere. And if people had adhered to this from day one, I think we would be so much healthier, physically, mentally, spiritually, as a society, as a country, because we respect each other and we understand each other. We wouldn't have had residential schools, certainly not in the way that we've seen. We wouldn't have pieces of legislation that prohibit people from being part of their community. We wouldn't have legislation that said, because of our different worldviews on child rearing or whatever it is, that we are going to apprehend your children and take your children away. If we had adhered to treaties, we wouldn't be portraying each other in a negative way, or First Nations people wouldn't be portrayed negatively through media, through journalism. It would be completely different if we had understood what the treaties were all about. Treaties were there to allow newcomers to Canada 150, 250 years ago, and it's still doing that. But it was on that principle that you're here, and you also have a responsibility to ensure that others can live well, right? To live a good life. And that's how these relations were entered into, and that's the responsibility that everybody carries. You're benefiting from living here, from being here. If you have a home, you've benefited from treaty. And so it's just to acknowledge, I think, that relationship.
Yeah, and I think as we were talking about earlier, that the phrase "we are all treaty people," we're all descended from people that had signed treaties, and so treaties touch every area of our life, because we all have what we have because of the treaties, and so
yeah. Absolutely. And, we all have a responsibility for that as well, right? And you'll hear our elders refer to, we entered into treaty because it was a relationship. Sometimes, again, referring to words, when we sign treaty, we sometimes, bring it down to a written piece of paper, and that's all we focus on, when in fact it's larger than that written text that is available for people to see. Even the Supreme Court of Canada has said the written text of the treaty is only one part of this relationship between First Peoples and non-First Nations peoples. And we have to understand what that is. We have to do the work, right? We have to take time to be able to look at that, and how we made this relationship, and what's required for us to continue to support and build this healthy relationship, or a healthy relationship.
Absolutely. And so I think that so that brings us to the Q&A portion of it. And so I'm going to close this so we can see the questions that come in. And so, yeah, feel free to put your questions into the chat. And I'm going to see if I could also find a way to allow people to share video, even if they wish. So first comment here, we have Monica. So Monica is just saying hello. Hey, Monica, welcome here to the chat. And then Lori says, thank you for the clarification that ceded doesn't mean surrendered, and treaty lands also don't mean surrender lands, but shared land. So Lori says, thank you for the clarification. So yeah, great. Thank you, Lori. So yeah, again, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to enter your questions into the chat. This is a chance to clarify any of the topics that we touched on today. Or just share your thoughts or comments, feedback. Now is a chance to do it. Just enter it into the chat.
And just Lori, just further to that, of course, the government's perspective is that it is ceded, right? They rely on the written form of the treaties, and you see there's tons of litigation on the written text of the treaties as well. So what I had talked about is a First Nation perspective to it and why we have the differences of opinion, and much of the conflict and unresolved matters today.
Looks like we have another message. All right, so Cheryl, so she says, it strikes me that the treaty relationship that we have been taught as settlers is so incomplete. Yeah.
That's absolutely true. And, you know, I often say, a question I ask is how many people remember taking treaties in the classroom? And the vast majority of people will say they never took it. But we have, you know, and speaking in Manitoba, the majority of us have taken treaties. And for me, I recall in grade 5 social studies. And it was, in fact, that version that you're talking about, that the treaties were entered into. The First Nations people gave up all of their land, which allowed for settlement, the building of the railway, and all of these other wonderful things that happened in the creation of Canada. And then that's it. So there's very little value placed on the significance of the treaties and what they've meant for this country, and the contribution then of the First Peoples. And that impacts a lot then on our view, right? Our perspective, how we view each other. Like, and so we have to look to provide that First Nation perspective, which is often missing in some of the education that we've received.
Vincent Kozdak says that he has to leave and he's wanting the recorded version. And so for everybody watching, we're going to be sharing the posted version, the recorded version online on our different social media pages. So Circles for Reconciliation and Reconciliation Thunder. You'll be able to find the recorded version there. And then Cheryl has some follow-up thoughts. She says, yeah, as a teacher, I strive to teach my students the full truth. And yeah, she's agreeing that, yeah, what she received was the whitewashed narrative. And so, yeah, good. Any other thoughts or questions from anybody attending? Oh, Steve Hildebrand says, clarifying. You said that the courts have recognized the Indigenous view of the treaties. So he just wants the clarification. Courts have recognized the Indigenous view of the treaties.
That there is an Indigenous view of the treaties. And in fact, the Supreme Court has said the courts is not the place to resolve this, right? That it's outside of the courts, because in the Canadian court system, you have a winner and you're a loser, and that's kind of it. And that's not the idea behind, it's not consistent with the treaty relationship. And so they've kind of punted it back to, you know, the politicians or the political will and the government to government relationship that needs to address that, and as a better place to resolve and reconcile those issues.
And I believe that there was a decision in terms of that we're to interpret them according to the spirit and the intent of the treaties.
Yeah, I mean, they've pronounced a number through different court cases, again, principles, right, that the parties should be following when dealing with conflicts or issues, treaty issues. And so it's a matter of those parties following them. And of course, if you don't follow them, you end up back in the court system. But the Supreme Court has set out a number of treaty principles that the parties, for the parties to follow.
Another question from Lori. She says, when offering land acknowledgement, did I hear that there is a languaging that is important to share?
I think it was like doing your homework in terms of the words that you use. So like cede, I'm on the unceded territory of whatever, right? And that's understanding what those words mean for the First Nations people as well. And as mentioned with that word specifically, it can, the word cede comes out of the written text of the treaties. And many people will say, you know, we never ceded our land through treaty, and people view treaties 1 to 11 as land surrender agreements. So it's just being careful in the languages that you do use when you decide to make land acknowledgements, because it's not just an easy exercise. You know, part of learning and educating and understanding is through the development of land acknowledgement statements, and don't be afraid to change it as you move along and you develop relations or you develop better understandings of the situation or the treaty or wherever you find yourself, right? It's we can't get stuck in one. You find one and you think, I'm good, we've got our land acknowledgement, let's pat ourselves on the back and move forward. That it's like the treaties, it's alive because you're constantly changing that relationship. So there may be different things that you want to include as part of your acknowledgement.
Yeah. And I think another good example is we touched on earlier is on the East Coast, when they were talking about, there was a memo that went out from the provincial government on using the word ancestral lands instead of traditional lands when you're referring to the Indigenous territories. And the reason why they wanted to use ancestral was because of a current land claims that were in court. And so using ancestral land, it was it's a strange thing because it's not like a land acknowledgement holds any a legal sort of bearing kind of a thing, but the idea behind it was to use the word ancestral to sort of remove that sense of title and ownership from the Indigenous nations. And so that was an example of an attempt to take away the significance and purpose and spirit of that land acknowledgement. So you look like you're doing something in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, but you're not, because you're using the wrong word. So ancestral versus traditional. So that's another one. And yeah, and possibly even like we talked earlier, like using language like signing a treaty versus entering into a treaty. So these are different examples.
And there are First Nations people that don't mind the word ancestral because it goes, sometimes when you have traditional territories, there's time constraints on that the use of that land. So this is not an easy exercise to do because there are a lot of considerations involved, as you say, Jimmy, to ancestral versus traditional treaty territory, that they all have time elements related to them. And so the best thing is to talk to the people in whose territory you're in and ask them how they want to be acknowledged. And that's huge in building relations. And then you're bound to start in a good way, in a better way. And don't be afraid if someone challenges you on some of that. And it goes to the level of education and awareness that you're receiving. And you say, wow, great consideration, I will change it. We have to be humble when we do these things, right? We have to be prepared to defend them, but at the same time, be prepared to make those changes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we probably ran out of time for any additional questions. So with that, I think that we're going to continue to sort of move along here, and so that's where we sort of tied up. And so just answer the question, what's next? And so with this, that's where we're coming to a close. Looks like I have a comment from Lori. Yes, thank you. That feels respectful and right. I have been invited a few years ago to write a land acknowledgement, and I hear the importance of considering and learning, and to ask and to continue learning. That's absolutely a great takeaway from this. So with this, we just want to turn over to you, Commissioner, to tell us a little bit about the events that are coming up that are being hosted by the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba.
Yeah, we're having a speaker series in the month of November, and much like yourselves and what I heard you talk about, people are wanting to get to the point of what can we do, and are really seeking guidance for that. And so we've developed a series, a treaty series every Wednesday, the month of November, starting with our elders, to provide some of that context, the history about the original spirit and intent of treaty making from that First Nation perspective, to lay the ground, because a lot of people either don't have access to elders or have never heard that perspective. And I think we have to understand that perspective, as I've said, to move forward. And then we hear a lot about Indigenous law and what that is as Indigenous nations. And so we're having Aaron Mills come in and describe that a little bit. People have maybe no concept of what that could look like and what that entails. And so he's going to take that a little bit to that level. We're also going to hear from Brenda Gunn, who talks about UNDRIP. A lot of people in the last year or so, a couple of years, have talked about UNDRIP, and that's a fantastic guide for moving forward. And she's going to talk about how UNDRIP relates to the treaties. And then we're going to have, once we kind of get a lot of that education, have a dialogue between Erin Mills and myself and say, okay, so how do we take all of this and put it in a way that we can make changes, wherever we are in all of those that you listed, that the health, the legal, the journal, all journalism, all of those areas of our professional lives and personal lives. How can we take this information and make those changes? And so it's moving from education and awareness to the action, right? As you've said, to go along. And so we're hoping that that's going to help the mind shift a little bit, and help people be more comfortable in making those changes and asking those questions, those critical questions. Why are we in the place that we are, and responding to, responses of this is how it's always been, so how do we get beyond those types of responses? So
Awesome.
sure. Come and join us.
Yeah, so we want to encourage everybody who's watching here to register for these and to join these really important sessions. And for those who are watching this recorded version, please share this video. Like I mentioned, this is going to be posted on all of our social media channels. So please, if you've watched this and you've benefited from it, please take a moment to share it. Share it with those in your network so that we can get this information shared. And we want to see more people. We want to see as many people as possible tune into these events that are going to be taking place next week. In terms of the upcoming events for Circles for Reconciliation and Reconciliation Thunder, we just again want to encourage people to sign up for circles, especially Indigenous participants. We need more Indigenous participants to join. And for Reconciliation Thunder, we are going to be sending out a survey soon just to give us feedback on the 9494. So watch out for that. And sign up to our mailing list to know of more events that are taking place beyond that. And thank you so much, Commissioner, for your time this afternoon and this evening. And yeah, hopefully we can have you again sometime soon in the future.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining, and everyone have yourselves a great evening.